The heavy silence of the boardroom didn't just break, it shattered under the weight of three women who had been holding their breath for nearly an hour. "Ariana, oh my God, I think I actually saw you sweat," Jennifer Hayes gasped, practically leaping from her chair. She didn't just walk over, she swarmed, leaning over the mahogany table until she was inches from Ariana's face. "The way you handled that last clause about the Jeju port, I thought he was going to reach through the screen and snap your neck, but you didn't even blink." Ariana forced her fingers to loosen their death grip on her phone. She smoothed the lapel of her yellow blazer, the fabric crisp and defiant, though her heart was still thudding like a trapped bird against her ribs. This blazer was her armor, a calculated choice of power dressing meant to signal that she was not intimidated by the shadows Dae-hoon cast. "It's just business, Jen," Ariana managed, her voice sounding thin even to her own ears. "Dae-hoon respects precision. If I showed weakness, the syndicate would have walked away with 40% of the equity instead of 15%. "Precision? Is that what we're calling it now?" Tracy Vance chimed in, circling Ariana like a shark that had caught the scent of blood. She leaned against the edge of the desk, her expression a mix of shocked excitement and predatory glee. "I saw the way your hands shook when you reached for your water, and don't tell me you didn't notice how his voice dropped an octave every time he said your name. Miss Davis, I find your terms provocative." "Give me a break, Ari. That wasn't a negotiation. It was a ritual." Before I tell you what happened next to Ariana, if you're already enjoying this story, click on the like button, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into it. The office, usually a sanctuary of high-stakes consulting and sterile professionalism, suddenly felt too small, too bright, and far too intimate. Tracy Cole, the most soft-spoken of the trio, let out a light, disbelief-filled laugh. She stood by the window, her hands raised as if reacting to the latest scandalous headline. "I've worked with the most ruthless CEOs in Seoul, but that man, he treats you like you're the only person in the world allowed to tell him no. It's terrifying, and it's the most romantic thing I've ever seen." Ariana felt the yellow shield beginning to crack. The professional silence she had cultivated for 3 years was being dismantled by her friend's relentless teasing. They were the amplifiers, turning the subtext of her life into a deafening roar. "You guys are delusional," Ariana said, though she couldn't stop the slight tremble in her lower lip. "He's a client, a dangerous, unpredictable client who happens to run the most powerful shipping empire in the country. There is no us, there is only the contract." "Then why are your pupils so dilated?" Jennifer whispered, leaning even closer, her eyes fixed on Ariana's face. "You're terrified of him, sure, but you're more terrified of how much you want him to stay on the line after the business is done. Admit it, Ari, the Ice Queen is melting." Ariana looked down at the phone nestled against her palm, the black glass reflecting her own wide, panicked eyes. She felt the weight of their gaze, the pressure of their expectations, and the suffocating reality that her mask was slipping. For the first time in 3 years, the professional ice wasn't just cracking, it was turning to water. The relentless interrogation from her colleagues caused Ariana's mind to slip, unbidden, back to the rainy Tuesday 3 years ago, when the yellow blazer had been replaced by a cheap, sodden trench coat. It was the night the Ice King had first stepped out of the spreadsheets and into her terrifying reality. She had been a junior consultant then, tasked with delivering a sensitive audit to a warehouse on the outskirts of Incheon. She hadn't known she was walking into a trap set by a rival faction looking to squeeze Dae-hoon's interests. The memory was a blur of strobe light headlights, the smell of wet asphalt, and the cold click of a switchblade against her throat. She remembered the paralyzing weight of true powerlessness, her breath hitching as a man with jagged teeth whispered threats she didn't fully understand. Then the world had gone silent.
A black sedan had glided out of the mist like a ghost ship. The door opened, and Dae-hun stepped out. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace that made the air itself feel heavy. Ariana remembered the way the rain seemed to avoid him, sliding off his perfectly tailored cashmere coat as if he were made of stone. He had looked at her first, not with pity, but with a clinical, piercing intensity that stripped her bare. Then he looked at the man holding the knife. "You're getting blood on a very expensive asset," Dae-hun had said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in Ariana's marrow. What followed was a masterclass in controlled violence. It wasn't the frantic scuffle of a street fight, it was the surgical precision of a man who viewed life and death as mere line items on a balance sheet. Within seconds, the man who had been a mortal threat to Ariana was a crumpled heap on the pavement. Dae-hun hadn't even broken a sweat. He had simply adjusted his cufflinks and stepped over the body as if it were a discarded wrapper. He had walked up to her, his shadow swallowing her whole. With a hand that was steady and impossibly warm, he had reached out and tilted her chin up. His thumb brushed the line where the knife had grazed her skin. "Are you brave enough to represent a monster, Miss Davis?" he had asked. In that moment, Ariana hadn't felt relief. She had felt a different kind of fear, the kind that comes when you realize the person saving you is more dangerous than the person attacking you. She saw the void in his dark eyes, the absolute lack of hesitation, and the crushing weight of his authority. He was a monster, undisputed and absolute. But as he draped his own dry coat over her shivering shoulders, she had felt a treacherous spark of electricity. It was the moment she realized that she didn't just want to survive him, she wanted to understand the darkness that lived inside him. She had accepted his hand, and in doing so, she had signed away her heart to the shadows of the syndicate. Now, sitting in the bright light of the boardroom, Ariana felt that same phantom warmth on her shoulders. The memory faded, but the realization remained. She had been under his spell from the very first drop of blood. The memory of the rain-slicked pavement and Dae-hyun's heavy cashmere coat lingered in the back of Ariana's mind like a persistent fever, but the sharp rap of Jennifer Hayes' knuckles on the glass table snapped her back to the sterile light of the boardroom. "Earth to Ariana," Jennifer teased, her voice dripping with a knowing mirth that made Ariana's skin prickle. "You've been staring at that phone like it's a holy relic or a murder weapon. It's hard to tell with you anymore." Ariana straightened her posture, pulling the lapels of her yellow blazer tight, trying to summon the Ice Queen persona that had served as her armor for 3 years. "I was just reviewing the closing statements in my head, Jennifer. Dae-hyun expects flawless execution. You know that." "Oh, please," Jennifer scoffed, leaning back and crossing her arms. She looked over at Tracy Vance and Tracy Cole, inviting them into the hunt. "We all saw the Zoom feed before we switched to the encrypted audio. Flawless execution wasn't the only thing he was looking for. Did you see the way he watched her? It wasn't business, it was an interrogation of her soul." Tracy Cole giggled, a sound that felt dangerously out of place in a room that had just hosted the head of a global crime syndicate. "She's right, Ari. Most people can't even hold eye contact with the man for more than 3 seconds without their knees buckling. But you challenged his maritime law interpretation, and he didn't even argue. He just leaned into the camera, tilted his head, and watched your mouth move like he was trying to memorize the shape of your words." "It's called professional respect," Ariana countered, though the lie felt heavy and bitter on her tongue. "Respect doesn't look like that," Jennifer countered, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. Respect is a handshake and a wire transfer. What he has for you is unprofessional conduct of the highest order. The man is a predator, Ariana. We've seen him dismantle CEOs with a single sentence. But with you, he's patient. He lingers. He calls you at 2 in the morning to clarify a tax loophole that doesn't exist, just so he can hear you sigh in frustration. Ariana felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She remembered those late-night calls, the low, gravelly vibration of his voice through the speaker, the way he would go silent for long stretches, letting the static of the line hum between them until her heart did gymnastics.
She had told herself it was work. She had told herself she was indispensable because of her mind, not because of the way her pulse spiked whenever he said her name. "He's a monster, Jen," Ariana said, her voice trembling with the effort of maintaining her mask. "You said it yourself. He's dangerous." "Exactly," Jennifer said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "And that's what makes it so delicious. The most dangerous man in the city treats his consultant like she's the only thing in the world that isn't for sale. You can't tell me you don't feel the tension. It's thick enough to choke on." Ariana looked away, her gaze falling back to the silent smartphone. The yellow shield was useless now. Her colleagues had seen through the fabric, straight into the heart she had tried so hard to hide. They were circling the truth, and Ariana knew that if she didn't find her footing soon, the walls she had built would come crashing down before the ink on the contract was even dry. The air in the room seemed to thin as Ariana's resistance finally collapsed. The relentless teasing of her colleagues had acted like a slow-moving tide, eroding the shoreline of her composure until there was nothing left but the raw, jagged truth beneath. She didn't look up. Instead, she traced the seam of her yellow blazer with a trembling thumb, her eyes fixed on the dark, reflective surface of the phone she thought was dead. "You want me to admit it?" Ariana's voice was barely a whisper, yet it silenced the room instantly. The playful smirks on Jennifer's and Tracy's faces faltered, replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. "Fine, you're right. I'm not just his consultant. I'm a woman who has spent 3 years drowning while pretending to swim." She took a jagged breath, the yellow shield finally falling away to reveal the exhaustion underneath. "Every time he says my name, it feels like a brand. It's not just professional respect, it's the way he pauses before he speaks, like he's weighing my reaction against his own self-control. It's the unspoken attraction that lives in the silences between our sentences, the kind of tension that makes my blood feel like it's humming at a frequency only he can hear." Ariana leaned back, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the secret left her. "But do you have any idea how much it hurts to love a man who lives in the shadows? To know that the hands I want to hold are the same hands that decide who lives and who disappears? I've spent 1,000 nights staring at my ceiling, terrified that the next time my phone rings, it won't be him asking for a legal opinion. It'll be a notification that he's finally met a monster bigger than himself." She looked at her friends, her eyes bright with a mixture of defiance and despair. "I love him. I've loved him since that night in the rain, and every day since has been a masterclass in self-torture. I watch him be ruthless, I watch him be cold, and then I see the way he looks at me when he thinks I'm not looking, and I realize I'm the only thing keeping him tethered to the light. It's not a romance, Jennifer. It's a tragedy I'm writing 1 billable hour at a time." The confession hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. The boardroom, once a place of logic and strategy, had become a confessional. Ariana felt a strange, hollow sense of relief. The truth was out. She had said the words she had choked on for 3 years. She believed she was safe within the 4 walls of her office, surrounded by women who understood her heart. She believed the nightmare of secrecy was over, unaware that the most dangerous man in Seoul was still on the line, drinking in every syllable of her ruin.
The relief of confession acted like a dam breaking, and once the first few words had spilled out, the rest of the 3-year history came rushing into the boardroom. Ariana didn't just feel the love, she remembered it in fragments of sensory detail that she had archived in the back of her mind like contraband. It wasn't just the big things like that night in Incheon, Ariana whispered, her voice gaining a melodic, nostalgic quality as she let herself truly remember. It was the tiny, impossible moments where the monster vanished and I saw the man underneath. Do you remember the Han River merger last spring? We were in the back of his sedan, the rain drumming against the roof so loudly we couldn't hear the sirens in the distance. He was reading a file and the streetlights were flickering over his face. For 1 second, he looked up and I caught him just watching me, not like a client, but like a man who was starving and seeing bread for the first time. He didn't say a word, but the air in that car became so thick I couldn't breathe. I looked away first, like I always do, but I felt his gaze on my skin for hours afterward. Jennifer and the Tracys remained motionless, caught in the spell of Ariana's vulnerability. Ariana's hand moved instinctively to her wrist, tracing the spot where his skin had once met hers. And then there was the gala, when we were signing the final papers for the logistics buyout. The table was narrow, and as I handed him the fountain pen, our fingers brushed. It was barely a second, a fleeting contact of skin against skin, but it felt like a physical shock. He didn't pull away. Instead, he let his hand linger over mine, his thumb pressing just firmly enough against my knuckles to let me know it wasn't an accident. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of the city's elite, the only thing that existed was the heat of his palm. I had to go to the restroom afterward just to splash cold water on my face so I wouldn't scream. She laughed softly, a bittersweet sound that carried the weight of 1,000 suppressed sighs. I've collected these moments like they were gold coins, a glass of water he pushed toward me when my voice cracked during a deposition, the way he stands slightly closer to me than he does to anyone else, claiming the space around me without ever saying a word. I've lived on these scraps for 3 years, pretending they were just professional courtesies, but you can't fake the way the air changes when he walks into a room. You can't fake the way my body recognizes him before my brain even knows he's there. It's been 3 years of pretending I'm a consultant, when in reality I'm just a woman waiting for the monster to tell her it's okay to love him.
Ariana leaned forward, her yellow blazer catching the late afternoon sun, looking for all the world like a woman who had finally found peace by surrendering to her own truth. She felt lighter than she had since the day she took the job. The secret was no longer hers to carry alone. She had shared it with the only people she trusted. She was finally free of the burden, completely unaware that the silent observer on the other end of the line was currently committing every word of her devotion to memory. The heavy, shared silence that followed Ariana's confession was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of stillness that precedes a long-awaited dawn. Jennifer reached out, her hand hovering near Ariana's shoulder in a rare gesture of genuine, unteased sympathy. The yellow shield was gone, leaving Ariana feeling raw but strangely light, as if she had finally shed a skin that had grown too tight. "I think I need a drink," Jennifer whispered, breaking the spell. "And I think Ariana needs a vacation in a country where crime syndicates don't exist." Ariana managed a weak, watery smile. "A vacation sounds like a dream, but first I need to get out of this office before I say anything else that could get me fired, or worse." She reached out to the mahogany table, her fingers brushing the cool, dark glass of her smartphone. She intended to slide it into her leather bag, to bury the evidence of her professional life and go home to be just a woman for a few hours. But as her skin made contact with the screen, the device flickered to life. The world didn't just stop, it inverted.
Ariana's breath hitched in her throat, a jagged, half-formed sound that died before it could reach the air. Her eyes, already wide, stretched until the white was visible all around her enlarged pupils. She didn't pick up the phone. She stared at it as if it were a viper coiled and ready to strike. There, at the top of the display, was the glowing green bar. It wasn't the home screen. It wasn't a missed notification. It was the active call interface. And the timer wasn't at 0. It was at 0847, 0848, 0849. The 43-minute negotiation had ended nearly 10 minutes ago. She had put the phone down. She had exhaled. She had been teased. She had remembered the rain in Incheon. She had confessed her deepest, most dangerous secret to the room, and for every single second of it, the line had been open. "Ariana," Tracy Vance sounded, like it was coming from underwater. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost."
Ariana couldn't speak. Her hand, previously trembling, was now completely frozen, her fingers hovering just inches above the digital proof of her ruin. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin as pale as the ivory suit she had almost worn that morning. The yellow blazer, once a symbol of her vibrance and authority, now felt like a neon sign marking her for execution. She had just told the most ruthless man in the country that she loved him. She had called him a monster. She had admitted to collecting his glances like gold coins. And she had done it all while he was still on the line, his silent, predatory presence drinking in every syllable of her vulnerability. Panic, cold and absolute, slammed into her chest. Her heart, which had been thudding with the relief of the truth, now seemed to stop altogether. The room began to tilt, the faces of her colleagues blurring into unrecognizable masks of confusion. She was no longer the brilliant consultant who could navigate any crisis. She was a woman caught in a trap of her own making, realizing with a soul-crushing certainty that the Ice King had just been handed the ultimate weapon against her. The silence from the phone wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a verdict. The air in the boardroom didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt pressurized, as if the oxygen had been sucked out to make room for a presence that shouldn't have been there. Ariana remained paralyzed, her hand hovering over the glowing screen of her phone like a moth near a flame. Behind her, the excited chatter of Jennifer and the Tracys had died a sudden, violent death. They had followed her gaze, and the realization was spreading through the room like a contagion. Then, the silence of the room was violated. It started as a faint metallic hiss, the sound of long-distance static, but as Ariana's trembling fingers accidentally grazed the volume rocker on the side of the device, the sound transformed. It became a heavy, rhythmic pulse. It was the sound of someone breathing. It wasn't the frantic, shallow breath of someone caught off guard. It was deep, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Each inhale was slow and deliberate. Each exhale was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to rattle the very glass of the conference table. It was the breathing of a predator that had cornered its prey and was simply savoring the moment before the strike. Ariana felt a cold sweat break across her forehead, the fabric of her yellow blazer suddenly feeling like a lead weight. She knew that breath. She had heard it in the quiet moments of midnight negotiations and in the hushed intervals of high-stakes calls. It was the breath of Dae-hyun. He was there. He had been there the entire time. The weight of her own words began to play back in her mind, each sentence a hammer blow to her survival. She had called him a monster. She had admitted to loving him for 3 years. She had confessed to memorizing the way he looked in the back of a rain-slicked car. The intimacy she had just described to her colleagues had been broadcast directly into the ear of the man she feared and desired most in the world.
Jennifer Hayes let out a tiny, choked sob and instinctively backed away from the desk, her hands covering her mouth. The other two women were equally statuesque, their faces pale masks of horror. The safe space had been an illusion. The walls of the boardroom had been transparent all along. Ariana's eyes remained locked on the timer. 09:12. 09:13. The numbers were an indictment. For nearly 10 minutes, she had laid her soul bare, and for 10 minutes, the most dangerous man in Seoul had listened in absolute predatory silence. There was no clicking of a keyboard on his end, no rustle of papers, no background noise of the syndicate's busy headquarters. There was only that steady, rhythmic breathing, a sound that told her he was sitting exactly where he had been during the meeting, his phone held to his ear, absorbing the wreck of her professional life. The realization was a physical blow. He hadn't hung up because he had wanted to hear this. Or perhaps worse, he had known she would break. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been obliterated. She was no longer the brilliant consultant in the yellow blazer. She was a woman whose heartbeat was being monitored by the Ice King through a digital wire. The rhythmic sound from the speaker felt like a countdown, and as the timer ticked toward 10 minutes of total exposure, Ariana realized that the silence was about to end. The rhythmic breathing from the speaker suddenly hitched, a sharp intake of air that felt like a physical touch against Ariana's cheek. The three women behind her scrambled backward, their heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor as they retreated into the shadows of the room, leaving Ariana isolated at the head of the table. She was a splash of vibrant yellow in a sea of encroaching darkness, her hand still hovering over the phone like a broken wing. Ariana. The sound of her name didn't come with the frost of a business deal or the sharp edge of a threat. It was a low, velvet rasp, a sound so intimate it felt like he was standing directly behind her, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. The panic that had been a freezing tide in her chest suddenly turned into something searing, a heat that made her vision swim. "I've spent 3 years listening to you lie to me," Dae-hyun continued. The sound of a lighter flicking open echoed through the line, followed by the soft embers and ash exhale of a cigar. 3 years of watching you pull that yellow blazer around yourself like a suit of armor. I wondered how long it would take for the ice to melt. I wondered if I would have to burn down the city just to see what was underneath. Ariana's throat felt as though it were filled with glass. She tried to find her voice, the professional consultant voice that had negotiated multi-billion-dollar mergers, but it was gone. "Dae-hyun, Don't," he interrupted, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated possession. It wasn't the anger of a boss who had been insulted. It was the hunger of a man who had finally found the missing piece of his empire. "You called me a monster. You said I don't have a soul. Perhaps you're right, but even a monster knows when he has found the only thing in this world that belongs to him." The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of his claim. Ariana could almost see him in his dark office in Seoul, leaning back in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he claimed her across a digital wire. "You've been collecting my glances like gold coins, Ariana." The way he repeated her words back to her was a caress and a command all at once. "Then it's time you realized that I have been keeping a ledger of my own. Every time you looked away first, every time your pulse jumped when I touched your hand. I haven't been waiting for a legal opinion, Miss Davis. I've been waiting for you to stop being afraid of the darkness and realize you were made to thrive in it." The phone felt heavy, vibrating with the raw power of a man who had just stopped being a client and started being a master. He didn't sound like he was going to fire her. He didn't sound like he was going to kill her. He sounded like he was coming for her. "Stay exactly where you are," he commanded, the velvet tone turning back into the steel of a syndicate boss. "The briefing is over. The negotiation is done. Now we're going to discuss the terms of your surrender." The line clicked. The green bar vanished. The silence that returned to the boardroom was deafening, but Ariana didn't move. She couldn't. The yellow shield was useless now, not because it was broken, but because the man on the other side of the world had just told her he'd been looking right through it all along. The hum of the office's central air conditioning was the only sound left in the boardroom, a mechanical drone that felt like a funeral dirge for Ariana's career. Jennifer and the Tracys had retreated to the far corner of the room, huddled together like witnesses to a beautiful wreck. Ariana remained at the head of the table, her hands flat against the mahogany, watching the street 30 floors below through the floor-to-ceiling glass. She didn't have to wait long. A fleet of obsidian-black sedans turned the corner, moving with a synchronized predatory grace that cut through the chaotic city traffic. They didn't park, they simply stopped, claiming the fire lane directly in front of the building's glass lobby.
The middle car was a sprawling armored beast, with windows so dark they looked like voids. Ariana felt a familiar shiver race down her spine. Not the cold fear of the Ice Queen, but the searing, electric anticipation of a woman who had finally been found. "He's here," Tracy Vance whispered, her voice trembling. Ariana didn't reach for her bag. She didn't check her makeup or straighten her hair. She simply stood, the yellow blazer glowing like a beacon in the dimming afternoon light. She walked out of the boardroom, her colleagues parting for her in a silent, respectful wake. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into a different world, the numbers on the display counting down the seconds until her life as a consultant ended forever. As the lobby doors hissed open, the cool evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and expensive tobacco. A man in a dark suit, his neck marked by the familiar ink of the syndicate, held the rear door of the sedan open. He didn't look at Ariana. He bowed his head, a gesture of deference that was never afforded to a mere contractor. Ariana stepped onto the sidewalk. The door of the sedan was a gateway. Inside, the plush, leather-scented darkness, sat Dae-Yun. He wasn't looking at a file or a phone. He was looking at the door, waiting for her. The streetlights caught the gold of his rings and the hard, sharp line of his jaw. "You're late, Miss Davis." His voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the very air out of her lungs. He didn't move to help her in. He simply watched her, his eyes dark with a possessive heat that made the 3 years of professional respect look like a joke. Ariana slid into the seat beside him, the door closing with a heavy, pressurized thud that sealed the rest of the world away. The interior of the car felt like a sanctuary and a cage all at once. Dae-Yun turned his head, his gaze sweeping over her yellow blazer before settling on her eyes. "The contract is finished," he said, reaching out a gloved hand to tilt her chin up, just as he had in the rain 3 years ago. "The consultancy is over. From this moment on, you don't work for the syndicate. You belong to the man who runs it." Ariana didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, the yellow shield finally falling to the floor of the car. The professional relationship was dead, but as Dae-Yun leaned in, his shadow swallowing her whole, Ariana realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The Ice King had claimed his queen, and the terms of her surrender were the only thing she had ever truly wanted.